So I'm curious your reaction when you came to church during the season of Christmas and picked up the bulletin, had it handed to you by an usher, and saw the artwork that was on the cover. Maybe you saw it as odd, shocking even, or perhaps even offensive and scandalous. I mean, baby Jesus in the manger, framed by a vision artistically of our Lord hanging on the cross at the foot of the manger. Horrific, colossal ambiguity. And it's not just on the bulletin cover and the artwork that the ambiguity of all this confronts us. You can find it in the writing of one of the luminaries in the canon of all English literature, T.S. Eliot. He wrote a poem entitled The Journey of the Magi that captured some of the ambiguity that we face on a day like today. In the poem, Eliot is giving voice to one of the wise men who had visited the cradle and then returned to their homeland in the east. A cold coming we had of it, just the worst time of the year for a journey. And such a long journey, the ways deep and the weather sharp, the very dead of winter. All this was a long time ago, I remember, and I would do it again. But set down this. Were we led all that way for a birth or death? This birth was hard and bitter agony for us, like death, our deaths. We return to our places, these kingdoms, but no longer at ease here in the old dispensation, with an alien people clutching their gods. I should be glad of another death. Well, Merry Christmas, everybody. What in the world is going on here amidst all this ambiguity? The wise men went to the cradle, the manger, to pay homage to the baby Jesus. And in their visiting him and encountering him, some form of death was envisioned, experienced. The past retired Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, picked up this poem as a kid, a child, back in England, and was fascinated by it for the rest of his life. And as he reflected on it as a grown man, he made this statement about that poem and that experience that the poem describes. A new start that is felt only as the death of all that has been familiar. And yet the old world goes on galloping aimlessly. T.S. Eliot never wanted to present religious faith as a nice, cheerful answer to everyone's questions, but as an inner shift so deep that you could hardly notice it, yet giving a new perspective on everything, and a new restlessness in a tired and chilly world. If you go back and look at the gospel reading from which all this ambiguity has ensued, the ambiguity is actually present in the gospel passage that we just shared itself. At the end of it, having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. Now, in a literal sense, they just probably picked up a new GPS device and went home on a different highway. But in a metaphorical and very, very real way, they went home changed as different people. What those wise men were daring to do as they gazed at the manger, encountered Jesus, and somehow came to terms with all that God was calling them to be and to do and to change about themselves and the world around them. What they were daring to do is what you and I need to dare to do. They were daring to do what the artist in the artwork on our bulletin cover did. They were daring to do what T.S. Eliot in his poem dared to do. They were seeing through Christmas. Seeing past the birth to what came later. And all the change that it implied for them. Because looming there on the other side of the cross, on the other side of Christmas, is the hard wood of the cross. And it's the cross that does come into view when we're given the grace to see through Christmas to the deeper meaning, the implications. In the Christmas season Christmas Eve of 1967, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. made the connection between the crib and the cross in his Christmas sermon on peace, his last Christmas sermon that he was to give. He said, "We once again stand in the Christmas season and think of the Easter season simultaneously, for the two somehow go together. Christ came to show us the way, but people love darkness rather than the light, and they crucified him. And there on Good Friday on the cross, it was still dark. But then Easter came, and Easter is an eternal reminder of the fact that the truth-crushed earth will rise again." Seeing through Christmas to the cross and the resurrection. Even closer to home than the gospel passage we shared and the poem by T.S. Eliot that I read, and it's also on your bulletin, closer to home than all that are the altar flowers up here in the midst of this Christmas season. You see those? Red flowers continuing the Christmas decorated church that's been here for a few days now, over a week. But in the midst of that red, Easter lilies in Christmas. Now, this is not just a nice touch, a liturgical flourish that makes a rector sinfully proud. Because, see, those flowers were actually given by a member of our parish, a parishioner, in memory of a loved one who died 3 years ago today in Christmas. Look at the flowers and see through Christmas. But the crib and the cross must be viewed together if we're able to determine and discern the true, enormous totality of what God's given us in that birth. God's gift of God's very own personal presence in our very own personal lives. God is with us everywhere, all the time and forever. God's with us in those raw and wrenching times when all seems lost. God is with us when life's limits, as we understand it, are reached, and what we face seems to be the end. God is with us in every single moment until the bitter end and beyond. That's what we need to see. We need to see through Christmas. We need to see deep in our own hearts and deep into the hearts also of our brothers and sisters everywhere throughout the world. We need to open our eyes to see the peace and the unity, the mutuality, the solidarity that God longs for us to find and be instruments of in the world God created. The radical unity that lies beyond differences, disagreements, distrust that often infect us. You see, the Christian message, the good news of the Christian gospel that comes from Bethlehem and Calvary are eerily similar because they're the same. this radical and eternal solidarity that God has shown to us in Bethlehem and on Calvary actually found its most definitive expression on the cross. God is with us absolutely no matter what. God even was willing to die for us and with us. God did it for us, for you and for me, and for all God's beloved children all around the world. When you look at it and accept it in the right way, this is not really a downer that comes in the midst of the Christmas season and threatens to do away with any lingering Christmas spirit we might have. It adds richness and depth to our apprehensions of the true dimensions of Christmas when we see through it to what it really offers and what it really demands. Consider, for instance, the witness of Elizabeth Vinken. On Christmas Eve of 1944, Elizabeth and her 12-year-old son Victor were living in a tiny rented cabin in the woods, deep in the woods, near Germany's border with Belgium. Elizabeth's husband Hubert was away in the war, fighting for Germany. Elizabeth and Victor had retreated to that tiny little cabin in the middle of nowhere because their beloved family home in Aachen, Germany, had been demolished by Allied bombing. They were caught right in the middle of what we now look back on as the Battle of the Bulge. Allied forces were making their way to Berlin and, not incidentally, to Adolf Hitler. So as the mother and son prepared for Christmas dinner there in that little hovel, they were startled by a knock on the door, which was incredibly startling because no one was around for miles and miles. So with little Fritz by her side, Elizabeth tremblingly walked to the door and opened it up and saw 3 young soldiers, all carrying arms. 2 of those soldiers were standing right in front of the door. One was lying in the snow, with the snow around him all red from the blood that was pouring out of his body. The men spoke in a language that Elizabeth and Victor didn't understand. Fritz, little Fritz, being a precocious child, finally realized that these 3 people were American soldiers. Now, Elizabeth knew what the penalty would be for anyone caught offering aid to the enemy, being shot immediately. But the soldier lying there bleeding in the snow was young enough to be her son. So she motioned for all 3 to enter the tiny little cabin, and Fritz and his mom helped the severely injured man into one of their beds. None of the Americans spoke German, but Elizabeth and one of the men communicated in French. So Elizabeth, needing to stretch their planned meager meal that Christmas Eve to accommodate their honored guests, told little Fritz, "Go get Herman." Herman was a rooster that she was fattening up in case by chance Hubert might have gotten home for Christmas dinner. Herman was named for Hermann Göring, a leader of the Nazis and a tactician of the final solution, whom Elizabeth despised. But suddenly there was another knock at the door. Fritz opened the door thinking it was going to be more lost American service members. Instead, he found 4 German soldiers, members of the Wehrmacht, the elite fighting force. They'd become separated from their unit and were seeking shelter for the night and from the cold. Elizabeth stepped outside to talk to the German soldiers about what they might encounter if they would come inside. She told them they were welcome to spend the night, but they had to leave their weapons out there. So when the young Wehrmacht corporal started to object, Elizabeth looked him right in the eye and said, "This is the holy night, and there will be no shooting here." So the Germans placed their weapons on the woodpile, and Elizabeth went back in and gathered up the weapons of the Americans and took them out there and stacked them there as well. So when they were all gathered inside, the enemy stared at each other in stony silence, wondering how long this temporary seeming truce was going to last. But Elizabeth took control of the situation, had the combatants mingle together, and introduce themselves. At one point before dinner, the wounded American began moaning, and one of the Wehrmacht soldiers who had studied medicine before being drafted examined him and determined that he was near death, but that if he could be rested quietly and cared for properly and with rest and nourishment, he might survive, the Germans said. So eventually everyone began to relax in that little hut. Both groups of soldiers started reaching into their backpacks to see what they could add to the feast. And the Wehrmacht corporal who had examined the injured American contributed a bottle of red wine that he had in his backpack and some rye bread. Pretty soon the soup for Christmas Eve dinner was served, and Elizabeth bowed her head to say grace. There were tears in her eyes as she did so, and there were tears in the eyes of all the service members from Germany and the United States. The next morning, after everybody woke up, the soldiers prepared to go back to war. The Germans crafted a stretcher from some poles that they found and from Elizabeth's tablecloth so that the grievously wounded American could be transported safely and given a better chance of survival. The American soldiers were lost, checking their map, and a German soldier reached over their shoulders and showed them how to get back to their own lines. They then shook hands with one another and headed off in opposite directions. So not long after this Christmas Eve, the war ended. The Winkens were reunited when Hubert, Elizabeth's husband, came home. And parenthetically, young Fritz, after he grew up, immigrated to the United States and ended up opening a bakery in Honolulu, Hawaii. But before all that, what was it that just took place in that war-torn Christmas Eve in a worried mother's little hut in the middle of nowhere? Elizabeth Winken was given the grace to see through Christmas. She saw all that Christmas really offered. She saw all that Christmas really demanded of a person. Elizabeth saw through Christmas. And with her help and her insistence, those German American soldiers, those young men, saw through Christmas as well. And what they saw is exactly what the Magi saw, lo, those centuries before. And none of those young men, or Elizabeth, or Fritz, would ever be the same after having experienced what they experienced that night. May God give us the grace to see through Christmas.